Noah and Kate, Chapter 36. Kate's day went by in a kind of distant blur, as though she were observing herself doing errands, but wasn't actually present for any of them. Even the physical work of helping Paige lug some bookshelves over to the new space couldn't penetrate her fog. Once or twice, Paige had to ask her if she was okay, catching Kate standing around moodily, her hands and chin resting on the end of the broom handle, her eyes all but glazed over. Even lunch with Jeff, although pleasant enough on the surface, felt like it was happening to someone else. They both probably could tell she'd been crying, but neither were indelicate enough to press her about it. Noah's departure date was looming over all of them and making them all face different feelings about it. Both her friends likely thought she was anticipating her upcoming grief. She was, of course, but it was so much worse than that. Being the one to end the Friends with Benefits agreement early had taken something out of her. Some part of her heart she hadn't known would hurt quite this much. All day she cherished the vain hope that Noah might stroll through the doors of Paige's new space, or show up unannounced at her lunch date, or just be there, across the street, leaning against his bike and waiting for her, vulnerability and hope in his eyes. But who was she kidding? She'd made it quite clear that their dalliance was over. She'd even managed to insult him with the line about how she'd needed someone better than him. Every time she thought of her own words, she cringed and fought back tears. How could she have said that to him? She could have just said it was time to stop because he was leaving soon, and it would be easier if he wasn't rolling around in her bed right up until the point his plane left. Or better still, she could have just enjoyed one last beautiful moment with him acting all sultry and loving and like he was going to miss her as much as she was going to miss him. Because he had been right. They had just been talking nonsense. Silly lovers' talk that meant nothing. Trouble was, he was wrong about them being lovers. And she wasn't made of steel. The reminder of how soon their affair would be over had been too much for her. He had been up for one last tumble in the sheets, because why not? At least that's how it seemed to her. She, obviously, hadn't been. So now, sitting on the dirty floor of what she was beginning to consider her greenhouse, a few trembling wisps of a promising new cultivar in her hand, she couldn't summon the energy to do anything. She could repot things, she could soak some new seedlings, she could even wash the windows again for something to do. But at this point, sitting on the floor, with the aroma of earth and living things and green abundance around her, all she could do was cry. She was in the process of wiping her nose along the sleeve of her shirt when a noise from the door to the house startled her. Luna stood in the doorway, concern brightening her soft blue eyes. "Kate, my dear, whatever's the matter?" "I'm sorry, Luna, don't mind me," Kate replied, embarrassment adding to her misery. What 30-year-old wipes their snotty nose on their sleeve? She dabbed at her eyes, with the other sleeve, naturally, and tried to look busy with the cuttings in her hand. "Nonsense," Luna replied, beckoning to Kate with a welcoming gesture that was in fact a grandmotherly command. Come inside. Tell me your troubles." And so, after brushing the dirt off her capri pants, Kate followed Luna inside, into the cool darkness that still somehow seemed to feel warm. She wanted to make small talk, to ask Luna how she was doing, to comment on the brightness of the day, but words failed her. It was all she could do to stop the tears that flowed so freely down her face, as though someone had turned on a faucet inside her and left it on. Luna busied herself making tea and brought 2 cups over to the kitchen table without all the fuss and fanfare that she usually seemed to so thoroughly enjoy. She took a seat across from Kate and pushed a teacup towards her, the milky liquid splashing a little onto the plastic tablecloth as the table wobbled a bit from the movement. "Now then," said Luna, as if only now they could proceed to the business at hand. "Tell me what's troubling you so." Kate closed her eyes for a moment, trying to come up with a way to tell Luna her story. It was one thing to tell Paige and Jeff about her Friends with Benefits relationship with Noah, But would a woman in her 80s approve? Or even understand? How would she even begin? A feeling of mild shame came over her when she thought about describing her purely sexual fling with Noah. Not that it was shameful, exactly, but that it was so unlike her, so far away from the kind of relationship she actually wanted, that even saying it out loud to Luna would sound wrong. "I don't know what to say," Kate said at length. "It's not easy to talk about. I guess the simplest thing to say is I've developed feelings for Noah, and I'm just so sorry he's leaving." Luna's eyes softened, and a sympathetic frown curved her lips. "I know, my dear. We're all going to miss him, but I know his departure will be the most difficult on you." "You do?" Kate asked, blinking. "I mean, you know about—" "I know there's a great attachment between you two, yes." Luna nodded gently. "It's easy to see. Whenever the two of you are together, the way you look at each other speaks volumes." This threatened to turn up the waterworks even more, and Kate took a shaky sip of tea to try to fend off more tears. Composing herself a little, she sat down the china cup. "I'm just going to miss him terribly," Kate said. "I knew he was going away, and in fact, I really want him to go, which is one of the hardest things about this. I want him to do what he's always wanted to do. The trouble is, what he wants is completely incompatible with what I've always wanted. We just can't work as a couple, and it's breaking my heart." "What is it you've always wanted?" Luna asked gently. "Surely it can't be entirely at odds with what he wants out of life." "But it is," Kate sniffled, emphatically, her words coming out nasally and muted. "He wants to see the world. He wants to be free to explore, free to be himself and not be encumbered with anything or anyone. And I want to settle down. I want to get married, have a family, and put down roots in this town. I've wanted it since I was a little girl. I've never had a stable family life growing up, and all I've ever wanted is to be part of a loving family with a husband and kids and a house and a dog and all that domestic stuff." Luna nodded. "I understand. But tell me this, if I'm not overstepping, my dear, is it possible that your idea of a happy family life is perhaps too narrow?" Kate frowned. "What do you mean?" "Well, I mean, of course, you may genuinely want to be married and to have children and raise them in a comfortable home. Many people do. But have you seriously considered whether this is truly the only route to happiness?" Kate shook her head. "I can't be like Noah, Luna. I can't follow him around the world and be carefree and cavalier about life. I just can't. I want my dream life as much as he wants his. And besides, even if I could go with him—" She paused, the lump in her throat threatening to close off her airway. "He hasn't asked me to. He has never suggested I go with him, and I could never put him on the spot like that." "I don't mean exactly that," Luna said, tilting her head a little. Her eyes roamed the room, and she seemed to be considering her next words. She returned her gaze to Kate. "Do you remember the first time you visited me? You asked me about the meaning of flowers, and I told you about my unfortunate beau." "Yes, of course," Kate said, drying her eyes on a napkin from a neat little pile in the center of the table. "I remember you saying something that really surprised me. You said marriage was unsuited to the heart, or something like that." Luna smiled self-consciously. "Well, forgive my stridency, please. Perhaps I spoke out of turn, not knowing how much it meant to you. I was simply recalling my own history, you see, and naturally one's own experiences tend to color one's judgment now and then." "You said you had been married once," Kate said, her own sad state making her less tactful, or maybe less able to tiptoe through eggshells. Indeed, but it was a bad business, and I never should have done it. It was annulled within 6 months. And so in many ways, it doesn't even count, as they say. But we did live as man and wife for half a year, and I had everything a young woman could want. In truth, I was wretched, and should never have done it. I should have been a great deal happier in life if I had simply continued as I had been. I had been blessed with a great love, you see, and I abandoned it. Stupidly, willfully, because of social impropriety. Kate expected Luna to reveal that she had been in love with another woman in her youth, and that in those days a same-sex relationship would never have been accepted. She was prepared to show Luna nothing but support and acceptance now, to make up for prejudices of the past. But what Luna said next truly surprised her. You see, I was in love with Benjamin Kincaid. Kate blinked, and then, although she was quite unaware of it, her mouth fell open just enough to express further disbelief. You're kidding. I'm afraid not. Kate leaned forward as if she needed to lower her voice for discretion. Benjamin Kincaid? Paige and Noah's grandfather? Indeed, Luna smiled, and now there was a kind of shine to her eyes, a glimmer of something that was more emotion than memory. Kate recognized it at once. Luna was still in love with Benjamin Kincaid, all these years later. Was he your... Did you marry him? Luna shook her head, and her coral lips pursed. No, sadly, we did not marry. And let me tell you, it was a scandal of sorts that we didn't. What happened? Kate asked, unabashedly curious now. She chastened herself and added, if you don't mind telling me. So few people know the real story, Luna replied, or could really understand it if they did. And I admit, I've never felt the need to correct the rumors and gossip that have surrounded me for so long. But, my dear, I do think it might be helpful to you. I was 20 when I met Ben Kincaid. He was 25. Well, I shouldn't say met. I should say when I got to know him. Cedar Lake was even smaller than it is now, and everyone knew everyone, by sight at least. And what a sight. Oh, my goodness, he was a handsome young fellow. All the girls thought so. You know, Noah takes after him so much. I must find a photo and show you, but some other time. Don't let me wander off. As I said, I knew him to see him. But when a help wanted sign appeared in his bookshop window, I immediately went in and applied. Because of him? Kate asked, charmed by the youthful glow effusing Luna's face. Oh, no, not at all, Luna said. No, to be sure, I was simply in love with literature. I had dreamed of studying the classics at university, you see, although it was a much rarer thing for girls to do in those days. I fancied myself a professor at a ladies' college, something of that nature. But my family was determined to marry me off to someone of substance, someone with social standing and wealth. And to be entirely truthful, I fully expected that to happen. It was the only world I knew. So a summer job at the bookshop would have to do. Your parents didn't mind you working? Kate frowned. Luna smiled. They did, but as long as it was respectable and temporary, they didn't seriously object. My mother did admonish me not to work at Lillian's, the dress shop next door, because it would be unbearable to think of a Travers girl helping all the matrons of the town squeeze into girdles and try to zip themselves into polyester cocktail dresses. Kate laughed, picturing such a changing room battle. Oh, dear, your mother was pretty harsh. You don't know the half of it. Luna laughed. At least the bookstore was a tad more genteel. Besides, I was headstrong and determined. I marched right into the shop and introduced myself to Benjamin. I said, "Name me an author. and I will tell you their best works, in order." "That was how you applied for the job?" Luna nodded once, with delightful defiance. "What else was there to say? Anyone could stock shelves or punch numbers into a cash register, but who else could advise customers on their next read? Who else but a lover of literature could tell a customer that they must read Virgil once they had finished the Iliad, or that Eudora Welty or Upton Sinclair were fine accompaniments to Sinclair Lewis?" Kate blinked. She had never heard of any of these people, but their names fell easily from Luna's lips, as though she were 20 again, bright and flushed with the love of books. At any rate, Benjamin laughed and challenged me on the spot. "List Jane Austen's best to simply great," he said. Of course, I said Pride and Prejudice was her greatest work, and naturally he agreed, but we argued. We actually argued right there at the counter about the value of Persuasion, which is clearly a superior work, over Emma, which is merely clever. We finally agreed to disagree, and I got the job. Kate smiled, able to picture the fierce little dynamo Luna must have been back then, if what she was now was anything to go by. Summer used to be a slow time for business back then, but Ben was always so devoted to the shop and his beloved books that he put in just as many hours during the slow times as he did in the fall and winter when the customers returned. He, too, was passionate about literature, you see. He had wanted to be a scholar and had dreamed of studying at Oxford or Cambridge and becoming a professor of literature, just as I had. But times being what they were, just after the war, well, the best he could hope for was to take over his family's failing bookstore. His father was ailing and passed that summer, and the family, he had 2 young sisters, you see, and a very nervous, delicate mother. The family needed him to make the store a success. I learned all of this through the long talks we had that summer, when people preferred the shore to the bookstore, and we were left alone together in the shop. I wonder that he needed help, or could afford it with so little business, Kate mused. "Oh, he needed the help," Luna replied with a wry smile. "The store was a shambles in every possible way. His father had kept no inventory records, his bookkeeping was a mess, and he had spent whatever money he'd made purchasing first and second editions, instead of stocking up on books people would actually buy. Ben was such a wonderful young man, so hard-working, so determined to help his family. Watching him struggle with all of it while remaining cheerful and so very kind. Well, I'm going to tell you a little secret now." Luna leaned forward and her eyes sparkled. "I had a generous allowance from my mother and didn't need the money. So I told Benjamin I didn't need to draw a salary. I would volunteer, essentially. He wouldn't have that, of course, but I did bargain him down to half the regular wage." "You bargained your way to less pay?" Kate laughed, shaking her head. "That had to have been a first." "I simply loved spending my days at the bookshop with him. I felt productive and like I was accomplishing something. And, of course, he was simply delightful to be with. Such a genuinely kind, thoughtful man. And, of course, sharing a love of books with him was icing on the cake. We always had something to talk about on those long, hot afternoons. And we did talk every day for hours. The arguments we got into." She slapped her thighs weakly with her frail hands, but her lively eyes jumped with delight. "We grew closer, day by day, and one day I was standing up on the stepladder to retrieve a copy of Pride and Prejudice. We were arguing about something Mr. Collins said in his first letter to Mr. Bennet, you see, and I was determined to find the volume and prove my point." She thumped her little fists into her lap for emphasis. "I found the book and was making my way down when I lost my footing and began to fall. Ben was there to steady me, and when he put his hands on me—" She demonstrated, splaying her hands along her sides. "There was a moment that passed between us. Something sparked in his eyes, and all at once we both just knew. Without a word passing between us, we knew." Kate stared, baffled that such a rom-com cliché had actually happened to someone in real life. to Luna. Just hearing her talk about Ben's hands on her made Kate a bit squirmy. Old people weren't supposed to have had sex lives, right? Yet somehow the woman sitting before her was no longer a frail old lady. She was 20 again, her eyes shining with the vivacity of a young girl in love. "So what happened?" Kate asked, curious in spite of her discomfort. "Did he kiss you?" "Oh, heavens, no," Luna scoffed. "You must remember, he was a very honorable young man. No, as I said, things weren't like they are today. Or rather," she trailed off, seemingly rearranging her thoughts, "in many ways, things were much worse than they are today. In those days, many men considered it acceptable to carry on with their secretaries and such, and his being my employer, but no, it was more than that. It wasn't simply mutual attraction." Luna's eyes brightened. "I think it genuinely surprised both of us. One moment we were friendly co-workers, or employer and employee, if you will, and the next moment, everything had changed." Kate bit her bottom lip, touched by the sweet wistfulness of Luna's expression. It was clear Luna had rarely talked about Ben, and was reveling in the memory now. After that day, there was a decidedly different flavor to our afternoons together. It was though our awareness of each other had heightened. Just standing next to him felt like we were actually touching. Just being near him, it was like a kind of electricity between us. Every sentence seemed heavy with meaning. Every glance spoke volumes. When he looked at me, I felt sure he had never seen anything in the world so captivating. I'm sure you've felt this, my dear. I can see by your face that you have. Kate was staring again, and shook whatever expression she'd adopted from her face. Yes, I definitely have. I'm sorry, I've just never heard anyone else describe that feeling so well." Luna smiled indulgently. "Love never changes, my dear. And I do believe it's as real a thing as you and me, as this house, as the flowers that bloom in the garden." Then, slowly, Luna's expression faded a little. Her brightened eyes dimmed, and she looked at Kate with a moment's hesitation before continuing. "I was the impetuous one, I'm afraid. One chilly evening, when the leaves were changing and the vacationers had begun thinning out, we were sitting by that marvelous fire. I'm so glad Paige has kept it. It's a lovely addition to the shop. We were sitting by the fire, and the radio was playing some wonderful jazz music, and, oh, it was just such a lovely tableau. I believed the moment was meant for us, and so, rather brazenly, I told him I loved him. I was rather desperate about it, I'm afraid, but when one believes that the stars have aligned to bring about some magical moment, well, I've learned to be gentle with myself on that score. I was so very young, after all. I'm afraid I'm in love with you, Mr. Kincaid, I said. What did he say? Kate asked, almost not wanting to hear the answer. If Ben had rejected her, and Luna had spent her life pining for him like some tragic Dickens character, he was flustered, of course, but not altogether surprised. It couldn't have been that shocking to hear, given how close we had grown. He made to go upstairs to that little flat above where he was living, but something stopped him, and he sat back down. He confessed to me that he had never been in love before. He'd had sweethearts and girls he found pretty or pleasant to talk to, but he'd never felt anything like real love. He'd thought romantic love was the invention of poets, or something more like infatuation. He admitted that some months prior he had been very casually dating a girl called Maureen because he admired her and knew her to be an earnest, kind-hearted person, but that he knew he wasn't in love with her. I asked him how he knew, and do you know what he said? Kate's heart leapt, feeling a vicarious thrill at the drama and romance of such a moment. She was fully invested now. Even if the roof caved in at this moment, she wouldn't have budged an inch. Because he was in love with you? She ventured hopefully. Oh, Kate, I can't tell you, Luna said, closing her eyes as though doing so would keep the memory inside. It was a jumble, what poured out of him, so much like dear Mr. Darcy in that wonderful scene in which he tries to tell Elizabeth he loves her. Only Ben was much more gallant. I remember his apologies, his vow that he had tried not to develop feelings for me because he was my employer and because he so enjoyed working with me and because he wasn't of my social class and could never hope to win me. And of course his shock that he should find himself as giddy as a schoolboy for the first time in his life. He was as ineloquent as I had ever heard him. But I didn't care. My Ben was telling me he loved me. In his fumbling, awkward, bashful way. It was the most beautiful moment of my life. Oh, Luna, Kate said, feeling her own tears stinging her eyes again. It wasn't quite jealousy that Luna had been given the gift of a declaration of love by the man she adored, but it did tug at her heart with the slight tension of envy. Luna shook her head slightly. Now, don't let me get carried away. We sat together for another hour, watching the fire, drinking our tea and listening to the radio. At one point, I took his hand in mine and threaded my fingers through his, and he didn't pull away. It was so wonderful to touch, to simply hold each other's hand, to feel the warmth of the other through our own skin. We talked a little, of course, but it was as though after our outbursts and declarations, it was enough just to sit in silence and simply be together, with this new acknowledgement between us. And when it was finally so late that we might fall asleep on the Chesterfield if I didn't go home, I left. Ben kissed me on the cheek, right here. She put a trembling finger up to her cheek, and he looked at me with such adoration, such soft, gentle love, that I was floating on air all the way home. Kate wasn't sure if this was the end of Luna's story. Times had been different then. Maybe Luna's great love had consisted only of some hand-holding and a chaste peck on the cheek. She waited, watching Luna's face for clues, and tried to think of what to say next. But Luna wasn't finished. She took a sip of her tea and paused before taking another sip and putting the cup back down on the saucer. I didn't know what was going to happen next, Luna said. I, too, had never been in love and had no idea how things were supposed to progress. I imagined it was up to him, as the gentleman, to suggest a date or make some sort of overture. I had done more than most girls would have. In expressing my feelings to him, I felt it was up to him to make the next move, so to speak. And it was lovely for a time, Luna went on. Going to work was exciting and wonderful. I so looked forward to seeing him. We would touch, occasionally, often quite by accident, and it thrilled me to no end. And as the weeks wore on, I found that I was growing more and more in love with Ben, and he with me. I could feel it between us. As I said, it is so very difficult to describe, but when you're in the presence of the person you are supposed to be with, it's as though the air between you grows weighted, or like time has paused, and a mere moment stretches out to an hour. Our gazes would linger on each other just that little bit too long. His eyes would follow me as I left the room, and mine him. As silly as it sounds, I believe we fell in love with our eyes first. Not simply each other's looks, you understand, but by looking into each other's eyes. Oh, Kate understood. She believed the common expression was eye-fucking, but she would rather chew glass before she said anything like that to Luna. Besides, she knew quite well that it was more than lust that passed between the glances of two people in love, or at least one person in love. She knew that she could look at Noah for the rest of her life and simply take him in, looking for every detail in his smile, every new expression of surprise or concern, and how it changed the contours of his face. And as for his eyes, she had never known what people meant when they had said they could drown in someone's eyes. Now she understood perfectly. She'd been drowning for quite a while now, and had no desire to come up for air. One day I brought in my mother's book about flowers and their meanings. I believe I told you about a young suitor of mine who sent me flowers based upon it, or am I remembering that wrong? You did, Kate nodded. I used to like looking up flower meanings too when I was a child. I thought it was lovely that someone would do that for you. Oh, it was thoughtful, Luna conceded, but a bit too smug, if I might be so bold. This fellow certainly thought he was being quite the Casanova with his little trick. Poor boy. He didn't know I was already in love, and had no time for boys who thought that a few flowers would overwhelm me with love. So it was more of a gimmick than a true gesture? That's it precisely. Luna's eyes brightened. But when Ben saw my mother's book and learned all about the flowers, well, his reaction was entirely different. So much more subtle and intriguing. He began bringing fresh flower bouquets into the shop and keeping them on the counter for the customers to enjoy, he said. Every few days it was something different, but every Friday it would be a bouquet of cornflowers. Beautiful blue cornflowers, so light and airy and delicate. Sometimes he'd pluck one and tuck it into his lapel button, or give me one to pin to my dress. It became our little message to each other. Cornflowers. Kate searched her memory and came up with it. Hope in love. Bachelor's buttons, they were sometimes called, because unmarried men would often do just what Ben had done. Wearing a sprig of cornflower meant the man was looking for love, or hopeful of love's return. And giving one to Luna, Kate was beginning to see how this affair of the heart had become so dear to Luna. So what did he do? Kate urged. She was anxious to hear about whatever grand gesture Ben had come up with to take their relationship further. Being a modern woman, however, Kate couldn't help but worry that this story likely had nowhere good to go. Something didn't feel right. For Ben to simply sit there when Luna had blurted out her love for him, and then say nothing more about it, save for some romantic dashes like poignant glances and cornflowers. Maybe things had been different in the 1950s, but surely not that different. In Kate's experience, if a man wanted a woman, he let nothing stop him from pursuing her. And if he were lucky enough to have his love returned, well, what was to stop him? Honorable is one thing. Hormonal is quite another. Well, you see, I was selfish, the way the very young and the newly in love often are. I am ashamed of myself now for thinking only of myself and my happiness, although I convinced myself it was what Ben wanted as well. We were in love, as if being so negated every other consideration. Nothing else mattered. I wanted him to court me. I wanted to be sweethearts. That doesn't sound selfish, Kate frowned. Didn't he ever ask you out? Luna shook her head. I waited patiently, but he never asked. It was a wonderful time, mind you. We read Pride and Prejudice together, the book I had been reaching for when I stumbled that day. And imagine my surprise when one morning he arrived at the bookstore with 2 tiny kittens, one black and one white. He'd found them abandoned by their mother up at his family's cabin and thought they'd make a delightful addition to the bookshop. We called them Lizzie and Fitz, after the characters in the book, and oh, they were such a hit with everyone. Delightful little scamps, gambolling all over the place and climbing up every bookshelf. So that's why it's called Lizzie and Fitz, Kate marveled, piecing it together. Because of the kittens. Well, yes, of course. But, you see, suddenly Luna seemed reluctant to share. She lowered her head and fussed with her hands. She looked up again and smiled, another rueful smile. Ben told me that we were like Darcy and Elizabeth. He wanted to rename the shop after us. And he took one of his father's books, a second edition of Pride and Prejudice, and, the silly fool, he inscribed it to me, all but ruining the value. He chose that famous quote of Mr. Darcy's, "In vain I have struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Kate's sense of uneasiness grew. These gestures, these grand declarations of love, these were storybook fantasies, not something men did in real life. Did they? Was it possible for a man to love a woman with such ardent admiration? Kate had never even heard of it, let alone experienced it. And the fact that all this tortured love had come from someone who had no reason to hold back, who could have at least taken Luna to dinner. Kate's spidey sense was tingling. "Luna, forgive me, I don't understand. Why didn't you two get together? Am I missing something? I don't mean to pry, but it just sounds so strange. You were obviously meant for each other. What happened?" Luna nodded slightly and looked down at her hands again. "Oh, forgive me. I fear I'm telling it all wrong, but you mustn't blame Benjamin. In the end, the terrible conclusion to all of it was my fault entirely. You see, I was the one that mistreated him. I'm the one that ruined everything." "Luna, no, I must own it all," Luna replied firmly. "It was my doing, and I have no one but myself to blame."